friends. This is John, your host of Dairyland Frights. And make sure, wherever you listen to Dairyland Frights, to rate and subscribe us. Give us 5 stars. We truly appreciate it. And make sure you give us a review so we can see how we can improve the show, make it better, and stay spooky. Welcome to Dairyland Frights. I'm John, your host of the paranormal podcast that covers everything spooky, creepy, and mysterious in the Midwest and beyond. And today, I'm bringing back one of my favorite guests that we had a little bit of what I call technical demons that inhabited our audio, and you got to hear one of my favorite people, Varla, talk about witches and kind of different things associated with them, that, witches aren't bad. They're here to help, most of them, and kind of talk about the magic right there. And like Varla, but, you couldn't hear me. So I said, I got to bring her back on because there's so much other things we can tell today. So thanks for coming back on, Varla.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me. I forgot how many technical difficulties we had last time. And we are in the Midwest, though, right? So storms could roll through at any given moment. So we're kind of an impending storm, but I think we're early enough in the day. We're going to be okay.
Yeah, we're going to be all day. We're going to be good. We're not going to have those technical demons get us.
No.
Awesome. So today, Varla and I were talking, and we were going through some subjects, and I was going like, what should we talk about? And Varla brought up 2 cool things, okay? And one of the cool things was back in the day, long ago, like 1500s, 1600s and everything, there was an issue with vampires. Like today, which is really funny, and I want your opinion on this, Varla, because I think it's really funny. So back in the day, as I want to call it, vampires were considered real, right? And they were considered, scary. They, no one wanted to obviously be bitten by a vampire, attacked by a vampire, because, they were demons spawned from Satan. And now we got movies like Twilight, where people are just running around, and we got
We're like, I'd love to be a vampire.
Yeah. And we got just, we got, some pretty good books. Anne Rice, as you know, wrote Interview with the Vampire, and there's some shows about it. But today, people treat it more like, oh, yeah, that's kind of cool. Maybe I want to do that. And there's a whole bunch of folklore and everything that I thought maybe we should cover because people didn't look at like that in the back of the day, as I say. So I'm rhyming.
Right. And yeah, so I love vampires are a wonderful topic because you also have the sort of modern juxtaposition of living vampires, people who identify with the vampire culture and use it as a magical practice, much like Themelites use the teachings of Aleister Crowley, right? So there is this kind of long-standing, sorry, my headphone just popped out. That's the level of technical difficulty we're going to experience. That's it. Yeah. We just satisfied that. But yeah, the idea of using some of the lore and I guess iconic aspects of the vampire to live this magical and transformative life, which I have many friends actually that are in the modern vampire community. Mm-hmm. And it is a combination of sort of cosplay and romanticism and really serious magic and ritual, trying to manifest a life that they want to live and manifest the things that they want in their life. And in this case, it's, like lots of parties after dark and, beautiful clothing.
Yes.
But the idea of immortality is kind of at the core of vampirism. And I think it really started making a rise in literature as we started learning more medically maybe more as a Western culture, because I think Eastern cultures had a much greater grasp on anatomy, and particularly like Chinese medicine had much greater grasp on anatomy and how the body works. But, in Europe in the 1500s, 1600s, the understanding of the body and the spirit and, illness was considered evil. And so protecting yourself from evil was often protecting yourself from germs. So this is why garlic is considered antidote to vampirism. because garlic itself is full of antioxidants. It's antibacterial, it's antiviral. It's an incredible plant, in particular in the bulb, but you can also get these things from the stems and flowers. And it creates this kind of immunity in your system if you consume it. It also can create kind of a smell that might ward off things like ticks or bed bugs or things like that. So the idea that garlic could ward off some kind of like sycophant in the middle of the night makes sense because you're warding off evil. So it became kind of a natural remedy to keep vampires at bay. And interestingly, there's wild garlic throughout the Northern Hemisphere. So you have wild garlic in Ireland, where there's a lot of vampire history. You have it growing all throughout Europe, throughout Asia. So there's all of these places where this strong medicinal plant grew and was utilized and recognized for, not just for flavoring, but for an actual as a treatment for medicine. So it kind of makes sense. Like if you're going to think that a vampire knocking at your door is the plague or even the flu, which, could kill you, that having this plant at the ready, whether it was on your windowsill or in your cauldron or in Bram Stoker's Dracula, they actually send, Van Helsing is the vampire hunter, right? He's the guy who's kind of trying to hunt the vampires. He sends Lucy, she's in this institution and she's obviously being visited by the Count Dracula at this point, and she's been bitten and everything. And he sends her flowers. And there's this passage, I put it in my book, Enchanted Plants. So put it in the garlic section, where there's this passage where Lucy is writing in her diary and she says, Van Helsing sent me the most curious flowers. They're very smelly and they're like little white stars. And she's describing garlic flowers. And what he did is he actually sent her the flowers of garlic, and then they would weave them together into a necklace for her and put them around the windowsill. So it wasn't like, so we see like the bulbs in a cross or something in all the old movies. That's how you ward off a vampire. But in this case, it was the actual flowers, which have this really intense garlicky scent. And it's just kind of a beautiful passage.
Yeah. And by the way, Enchanted Plants is Varla's book. Please check it out. Please buy it. Give her some love, because it is chock full of great I would say maybe some things you want to consider other than using, not to say don't go to your doctor and everything like that, but maybe, Varla, don't you think there's some things in there if you're like looking for something a little different, maybe it could help you in certain ways. But again, always make sure you're doing everything in your power to get all the facts straight before you start.
Disclaimer.
Yeah, disclaimer. Don't go out and start picking mushrooms.
We're not medical professionals.
We are not medical professionals. Don't go out and start picking mushrooms and then start doing something like, okay, just make sure you get everything back. But it's a great book that's full of knowledge that can at least give you, hey, maybe some ideas and maybe something like that. Because like I said, we're not medical professionals. That's something, again, as we talked in our last podcast, that some doctors are coming around to it. Like maybe we need to look into plants as maybe another source to help people become more healthy and get rid of certain diseases and stuff like that.
Absolutely. And then in the book itself, because I just take like this botanical lens on fairy tales and folklore, but I do include magic and medicine and some plant facts in there. The idea is that, I'm not giving you a recipe, but the idea is that you are, through those stories, you're coming to understand the plant itself on a different level. Right. Whether it's through an old fairy tale and you're kind of seeing its role in society, or you see this particular legend about, why a flower is called a hyacinth or whatever. And for me, I think like all plants have stories. So when I learn these things, it helps me understand the plant, it helps me recognize the plant, it helps me grow the plant because I have a stronger affinity for it, or sometimes a stronger disdain for it, depending on what you discover or your reaction to it.
Yeah, absolutely. So how about we get into the topic today? And speaking of plants, we're in the Midwest, and I have a lot of my audience in the Midwest. And corn is a staple for us, right? There's corn
Yes.
days, and you grab some corn, throw
Corn
it on
Palace.
corn palace. Grab some corn from your local farmer and throw it on your grill. And, there's a million things you can do with it. All right.
Yeah.
But what if I told you that sometimes corn can be deadly and maybe, just maybe, give you vampire traits that people consider you a vampire? So I love this. I absolutely love this. And I didn't think about it. I heard about this, but I want to get into kind of some interesting things that kind of talk about not only corn, but also there's other conditions, actually medical conditions, that can make you look like a vampire. Or maybe people back in 1500s would consider maybe you're a vampire and you weren't. It's just a medical condition. And unfortunately, I don't know if there's a cure, but it's not great. One of the conditions too which we have today, is rabies. Because remember, rabies, it's still deadly today. It would kind of make you, when you see a dog foaming at the mouth and everything, back then they would think like, oh my God, that dog's possessed by a demon or something. Well, it has rabies. And if you get bitten by a dog with rabies, it can be very deadly unless you get help very quickly.
Right. And you basically, then everyone assumes you're a werewolf and that you were bitten by a werewolf.
Correct.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So in today's world, it's still a bad thing, but we have medical science to say, okay, you got rabies. Yes, it's bad. We'll take care of you. And there's ways to cure you. Back then, there were no ways to cure you. You just died this painful, slow death.
Sure. And bats are a carrier of rabies. So
correct. Absolutely.
Straight for the throat.
We won't get into the Black Plague and everything. That's a whole different thing. That was with fleas and stuff. Would you still have fleas today? I mean, if you have a dog or a cat,
resilience,
and you're not giving them proper flea medicine or a bath, or you can have fleas in your house. I think it's not funny, but it's kind of funny, right? Like we still have things from the 1400s, 1500s. It is 2026 and we're still going, oh no, I can have fleas in my house.
All kinds of little bloodsuckers. We got mosquitoes, bed bugs, ticks.
Yeah. Those
fleas.
Aren't going away, folks.
We're all after our blood.
Yeah, it's hilarious, because you think we would have just have just give them a shot. Like, if you watch Star Trek, like me, I'm a sci-fi geek. Let's give you a shot. You're okay. Nothing's going to attack you. No, we don't have that yet, folks. The other one was tuberculosis. So tuberculosis is still today. We still have tuberculosis. But again, remember, tuberculosis made you look pale. It made you look, you had trouble breathing. You looked weak. You just looked, you were thin. Yeah. I mean, you
life
went from
was being drained from your body.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the other ones too is, and I might need your help on this, Varla, because I'm a mushmouth, but there's an inherited blood condition known as porphyria. Is that how you pronounce it?
Porphyria. Porphyria. Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. Okay, great. So this is an inherited blood condition that displays symptoms such as sensitivity to sunlight, receding gums, which could have made the teeth look like fangs, and aversion to garlic. So guess what? 1500s, whatever, you're probably considered a vampire. If your gums are receding, you go out in the sunlight and go, oh, what's going on? And someone has garlic, they're cooking with it, which was, pretty common in some European countries to put garlic in everything.
Well, it's also a preservative, so it helps the food stay fresh longer or be edible longer without getting sick. So it's definitely heavily used.
Yeah, exactly. And this condition is still today. Unfortunately, it just comes through it's
just an inherited genetic thing.
Yeah. And it's really interesting. So here we go. Let's get right into, why does corn, you're probably asking yourself, turn you into a vampire? Like, am I not supposed to be eating corn anymore?
With vampires.
Yeah.
Because if I asked you, go ahead.
Oh, no. I was just saying that, again, I don't want people to think you can't eat corn.
Oh, no, we'll explain it. By the end of this, you might be craving corn.
Yes.
I'll be wanting like a nice hominy. Well, because if I asked you what plant you would associate with vampires, you would probably say garlic. Most of us would
Correct.
say garlic. When I was working on the book, I knew I was going to include in the garlic, I wanted a garlic section, and I knew I was going to include the vampire lore and passages from Bram Stoker's Dracula, etc. But there's a even stronger connection, if you can believe it, maybe not stronger, but the connection between corn and vampirism. And essentially it starts with the fact that corn is indigenous to the Americas. It does not native to Europe at all. And so post contact, so we're talking like early fits, a lot of seeds were coming back, even probably even before that. But in particular, post contact in North America, so when the colonists are touching down, and seeds are being sent back to Europe and being introduced. Seeds such as pumpkins, which are also indigenous to the Americas, tomatoes, and other members of the nightshade family. Potatoes are native to the Americas, in particular, and to South America. So as there's this, whatever you want to call it, I just call it contact. It's often pillaging and ruination, but
Right.
that's how it turned out. But at this time, corn seeds were brought back. Corn is, it's believed to have been cultivated by the Maya, like, I don't know, 7,500 years ago. There's archaeobotanical evidence of corn that it was actually cultivated from a wild grass. And basically it's this like major feat of horticulture, because other than there being different variants of corn, different varieties of corn, the corn itself genetically has not changed very much since the Maya first introduced it as an agricultural crop thousands and thousands of years ago. So it's growing indigenous, throughout like indigenous America, readily also cultivated as a crop, as a food crop. And because of this, it is a sacred plant. It feeds the people. It grows really fast, especially in the Midwest. You plant your corn and it's in a matter of months, you can have a full edible crop. You save the seeds, you grind them down, you've got flour. It stores really well. It can dry out and then be rehydrated again. It's just a great food source.
Yeah.
As we have colonists coming over and they're observing these different foods and trying to grow them themselves, they miss a step. So one of the traditional practices, and you see this is great examples, and like there's Cherokee recipes calling for like these different kind of hominies or kind of corn stew. You also see it throughout, the Midwest. You've got Dakota, Lakota, Anishinaabe, like Ojibwe, all grew corn. And there's a very key process with corn, and that is the introduction of ash or lime in the Southwest and what is now is Mexico, Central America. A lot of times some kind of lime was added to this. Now, I don't just mean a lime, but like a lime agent, a quickening agent that would probably be from a mineral source. But one of the best ways to do it is ash. And so you would take the ash from a tree, ash from your fire that you're cooking on, and you would add it to the cooking process. This allows the corn to go through something called nixtamalization, which is a process that breaks down the sort of, you can eat raw corn and it's not bad for you. Mm-hmm. But if you want to be able to get the high doses of niacin, a vitamin, I think it's B3, right?
Yeah.
If you want to get those high doses of that, this process of adding the ash, this nixtamalization, will release that. And so what was happening is this plant was introduced to Europe, and where it did wonderfully, in particular in Italy, in the Mediterranean. If you think about Italian food, there's a lot of corn-based things. Polenta is a corn-based dish. So it very quickly, like tomatoes, adapted to this Mediterranean climate. And how wonderful, because now you have this food source that in a matter of months is ready to eat. And Italy traditionally has had a lot of poverty, especially in the, a huge discrepancy between the have and have nots. particularly in the south of Italy. So you have this crop that's doing great, and people are eating this corn that's cooked down, or they're eating it in various ways, but they're not using that, adding the ash. It's like that got lost in translation or got ignored. Oh, why would you put, dirt in your food? Whatever.
Yeah.
Super key step. So what was happening is people were eating this food, and you have to remember, like, this wasn't where you had like polenta as a starter and then you moved on to your like main course, right? This was your meal of the day. You filled up on it. And if it's not offering complete nutrition, that can lead to a deficiency. Remember, again, we're talking about like this is your main food source and you're eating a lot of it. So for certain people, would cause something which became known in Italy as pellagra, which is basically niacin deficiency. And the symptoms of pellagra are sensitivity to sunlight, hallucinations, and a confusion of time and space, a change in demeanor, sometimes identified as like a bloodthirstiness or like a, like very angry, and extreme paleness, and weird like sores that would form all over your body eventually as you develop this extreme niacin deficiency. If you were to look up, and I'm going to tell you they're gross, but if you wanted to look up pictures and you typed in pellagra, you would see some pretty gross illustrations even from the 17th century, where it sort of depicts a creature that is not unlike Nosferatu, like definitely they're very sunken, kind of covered in scars and sores and sort of withdrawn from the world. At the time, this, there was a widespread belief in vampires, especially in Italy and Eastern Europe. And so this led to a vampire craze, essentially. It wasn't as extensive as the witch craze, which was kind of simultaneous. While that witch craze was happening, we also had people who were being killed for being werewolves and vampires, and especially vampires. And so still to this day in Italy, you will see an article about an archaeological dig where there's a brick in somebody's mouth, because that was thought to be a way, if somebody died as a vampire, you could keep them in their grave. So it was believed that that's what was happening. And it wasn't until centuries later, I believe it wasn't until the 1920s in Appalachia, when the same thing started happening and people started developing pellagra, that they were able to identify what was actually happening was that the niacin was not being released into the body in the proper way, and the body was kind of turning on itself, and you had this extreme deficiency.
Yeah, so, exactly. And what was really concerning was the fact of one of the telltale signs of it was on the corpse was a ring of cornmeal around the mouth of the deceased. So
That's
when they
so
would,
gross.
So Varla talked about, the vampire craze. They listed as like a vampire epidemic, excuse me. And one of the biggest things with that was, again, wasn't as bad, thank God, as the Salem, witch trials and stuff, but it was still bad that people would turn on each other and, be like, oh, I think he's a vampire or she's a vampire or whatever. But typically those people would die shortly after that. From their disease.
It was a shorter lived punishment, right? Because the person was, at this point, if they were identified as a vampire, they were quite sickly. Unlike being called a witch, in the 1500s in Europe, if you were called a witch, you really had no way of getting out of it. And then again, you move over to the Salem witch trials in the 1600s in Massachusetts, and you have the same thing. It was like the accusation, once the accusation is made, it's like modern media today, right? It's like once the accusation is made, it's hard to, it was impossible then to reverse that. There were very few people who were accused of being witches and then let go. But with vampires, I think they kind of waited for them to waste away and then would bury them in a manner that they couldn't return from the dead.
Yeah. So what was really interesting to me was, how do you think this went from, they're a vampire, we need to, put a brick in their mouth or, put whatever, holy water, or bury them far away from the village, to they're coming back to life, right? I mean, they're
Mhm.
immortal. How do you think that changed? Like, that's one thing I didn't understand through my research is like, wait a minute, these people are dead. And there's a craze and they
Right.
want to see if their neighbor was a vampire. They dig him up. They see the cornmeal around their mouth and go, oh, he was a vampire or she was a vampire. But then how did it get from I see Varla walking the village and she looks fine?
Right.
You know what I'm
Well,
saying?
yeah. I mean, so some of that is more of our like modern view of like this vampire comes back and they're
Yeah.
immortal. They're preserved at the perfect age of 35 when they died or whatever, and they
Yes.
come back and they, it's that whole sort of legend, and a lot of that we attribute to Bram Stoker and his
Yes.
sort of the way that he kind of created the modern vampire based
Correct.
on ancient myths and legends from Ireland as well as Transylvania and Eastern Europe. And he created this, this amalgamation of different vampire traditions to create this one, Vlad Dracula that to this day is our icon of vampires. But there's a couple of things at play, I think. I mean, and I'm not dismissing the supernatural element of it
Sure.
entirely. However, one of the things at play is misdiagnosis, right? So,
Right.
or just calling someone dead when they're not actually dead. And so any motion of, movement in the ground if they've been buried, or moaning because you found out you were buried alive or anything like that if you're that close to death and you're buried prematurely, you aren't exactly going to get up and live again. Although there is one funny story about that, a woman that happened to in Scotland.
Okay.
But generally, you were already on death's door and now you've gone through this trauma of being buried alive. So you're not going to make it much longer after that, but you might be, unearthed and they find that you're breathing. There are also things where there were legends about, people who were vampires and they would dig them up and their bodies were perfectly preserved.
Correct.
Well, all kinds of things can make your body more preserved. It can depend on what you're buried in. It can depend on the kind of soil that you're buried in, the climate that you're buried in. So especially people who had immigrated from Europe and were used to a certain kind of climate, and then maybe they came over to Massachusetts. There's a couple of vampire legends there where like someone was unburied and they looked exactly the same as when they had died. So, this is all pre-preservatives and stuff. There's that, the whole, like in the original 1920s version of Nosferatu, where they kind of the iconic scene where his arms are crossed and he slowly rises up. So not everyone was buried in underground, right? A lot of people were buried in crypts. So their bodies would be, and still are, in a crypt. And so in particular, like in Scotland, I'd say the late 16, what you had a lot of grave robbing going on. And the grave robbing was not just because people wanted, Aunt Elda's ring or whatever. It was often for medical purposes. People, whatever, couple of poor guys would be paid from the medical institution to secretly go into and you need a fairly fresh body. You would not want to go and get an old body because they're trying to advance medical science. So trying to do autopsies, which was completely illegal, right?
Yeah.
So you find out someone's dead, you go in there and you go to get their body. Well, there was no understanding of rigor mortis. And so if a person is in a coffin and they are laid out, and it was traditional for men to be buried with their arms crossed like that, when you pop that coffin lid off, the body in rigor mortis can naturally just sit upright and sometimes make a moaning sound or release air. See that in crime shows all the time, right? So now what would you do? You're already kind of in a sketch situation, right? Because you're doing something illegal, and then you just crack this thing open. You're going to run from there and you're going to, say that it's a vampire. So those are some things that kind of gave credence to the idea of life after death, and that vampires were immortal and were perpetual. But one of the biggest legends is a story in Ireland, and I'll probably get it. I guess I could look at my book, but I'll probably get it a little bit wrong here. Essentially, there was this really like evil, like king, like the head of the clan, and he was a very brutal man. And so eventually someone killed him and they buried him, but they buried him. I think they buried him standing up. because that was like something that you did for, the head of the clans. And not long after that, people began to see him again, and he was such an evil man alive that they would see this ghost and they would fall ill after seeing him.
Yeah.
And so it became believed that he was actually out there roaming around and that he was a vampire and he was taking revenge on everyone, basically. So there's some stories like that as well, that all kind of, over centuries and centuries. And the great thing about stories, storytelling, fairy tales, and folklore is that they are meant to evolve. I think sometimes people get stuck in this idea that we have to have the original version, but they're meant to evolve, and they have evolved.
Right.
And in fact, many of the versions that we have access to are already evolved centuries past when they were first told. So you got all the Grimm versions, which were centuries after, and this was after the introduction of Christianity throughout Europe. So all of these different things kind of come into play when it comes to the vampires.
Yeah. Now, before we get on to a nice segue there into fairy tales, I just have a question for you. Why do you think books like Frankenstein and Bram Stoker's Dracula has endured centuries? I mean, most books, unfortunately, fade away. And, you might have a really good book that you rediscover, right? Oh, yeah, I used to read this when I was a little kid. Yeah, but this, centuries. Even though we know there's no possible way this could happen, or is there?
Right. Well, I mean, Mary Shelley was writing about something that was a hot debate at the time. It was the Enlightenment era, and people were talking about whether or not God had a role in, the fate of man as far as their own actions went and as far as their bodies and medicine went. Again, same kind of era where there was a lot of unknown, but a lot of doctoring and the exploration of medicine to treat certain ailments, and a split in the mindset of like church and science was really taking place during that time.
Right.
And in addition to that, Mary Shelley most famously had lost a child. I think she had actually had a couple of miscarriages, and so had lost a child. So there's the grief, the mourning. I mean, who wouldn't? If you had that opportunity, that's the basis of Stephen King's Pet Sematary too,
Exactly.
right? Like, he got the opportunity to bring this thing back to life that, most of us would say, and at least in a moment of deep mourning, that we want, just give me one more afternoon, right? Give me one more afternoon with them. That's all I need. So I think there's this inclination within our brains. And then I think both with Dracula and with Frankenstein, with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, they both touched this sort of societal nerve, but were also really, really beautifully written. They're both beautifully written. I have read both of those books probably 10 times in my life.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
Started as a teenager, and now I'm an old lady and I see different things in it, and like Stoker's Dracula is told in a series of letters and journal entries. So is Frankenstein. It kind of all starts out with this, once upon a time, let me tell you the horrible thing that I did. And then the whole story of Dr. Frankenstein and creating the creature is all the backstory that this guy is retelling. And someone's writing this all down to share the story. So, then I think because of that, because they're well written, because they touched a nerve, they were retold again in a way that was suitable for the next generation. So you had Nosferatu in the 20s, you have Bela Lugosi, you have these different versions, and the same thing with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. You had it retold enough that it became something very iconic. And so therefore it has like really endured, and it plays with some of the basics of humanity. What would you do? What would you do if you were faced with this situation?
Yeah.
So they have an endurance in the classics, but I think pop culture has also helped keep those things alive. So that's what the greatest thing is, that Dracula is totally immortal.
Yeah, exactly. I always quote my favorite line from one of the most silliest movies that Steve Martin ever did, called The Man with Two Brains. And the line is, You're playing God. Somebody has to.
Oh yeah, that's the one with like Abby Normal. That's who he gets the brain
Oh
from.
no,
Or is
that's
that?
Young
Oh, that's Young
Frankenstein.
Frankenstein. That's
This
Young
one is
Frankenstein.
where Steve Martin, his wife he loves, dies, and then he meets Kathleen Turner, who looks like his wife, and he's going,
Yes.
and then she dies. Then he's trying to like use her body and put the mind in there.
Yes.
Kind of like
The
a
Man with Two Brains.
Frankenstein. He's trying to put a different mind in there of another woman to make it. And it's totally silly. Like movies like that, Young Frankenstein, so kind of make fun of the whole thing, but also, again, other movies, there's been so many about Frankenstein, about Dracula, about the Mummy, whatever, different fairy tales. So speaking of fairy tales and how they've endured, I will have Varla. You said you have a great, Cinderella story?
Yeah, I have a version of Cinderella
for our spooky friends.
Yeah. So this is a good bedtime story if you're a weirdo, or have it over coffee and maybe listen to it before you let your children listen to it. Only because there's some pretty brutal parts, and I'm not going to censor that if that's okay with you.
Nope.
The brutality, we're going to go all the way.
That's great.
Because this is the original Grimm's. This is sort of the Grimm's version, which is the Grimm brothers were recorders. They recorded stories. They didn't write these stories. They recorded these stories from all of the people and villages around Europe, especially throughout Germany, where there are a lot of traditional old folk tales. And so Cinderella, and this just kind of connects to what we were talking about earlier with corn, in that if I were to ask you what plant you would associate with Cinderella, what would you say?
What plant? I was just going to say a flower, but...
well, I think most people associate pumpkin.
Oh, because pumpkin. I'm sorry, pumpkin. Yeah.
Because the coach, they turn a pumpkin into the coach, and that's what she writes to the ball in. And then it turns back into a pumpkin by midnight. And that's a common phrase we use, right? Well, I got to get home before I turn into a pumpkin.
Right.
Get home before midnight. So what's interesting about that is that pumpkins are indigenous to the Americas. Cinderella is a European fairy tale. Pumpkin seeds were not introduced and widely planted in Europe until, again, probably the 16th century, the 1500s, maybe the 17th century, once it became really like a stable crop where, that takes a few generations for farmers to adapt and say, oh, yes, this new food thing, it did great throughout the Mediterranean, beautifully in France. France has like this gorgeous climate in many places, and pumpkins just did beautifully there. And, you look at a pumpkin, there's a pumpkin variety called the Cinderella pumpkin because it literally looks like this gorgeous, magical thing that a fairy would live inside. So you can kind of see how they quickly made their way into, some of these plants made their way into what we now know as common fairy tales. But it was a guy named Charles, I think his first name was Charles Perrault, and he was the one who introduced pumpkin into the Cinderella story. He was a folklorist and sort of a kind of a contemporary of the Grimm brothers, but he put his French twist on everything. And so the Cinderella story changed with him. He retold it. He had new illustrations, and he introduced the pumpkin into this story, because pumpkins were kind of becoming very popular and were revered as these sort of, the fairy tale magical, like. But prior to this, the story was known as Aschenputtel, which is Cinder Girl. And it was a German story that went back centuries before the Grimm brothers even recorded it. And the plant that is actually at the center of that story is a hazel tree, which is there is no pumpkin. There's no fairy godmother. There's a hazel tree. And what happens is a lot of the story as it's set up has not changed. You've got a man whose wife dies. He's got a young daughter. He remarries. And that woman has two children. So the stepmother and the stepsisters are very mean to little Aschenputtel, to little Cinderella. And true to, all the versions, she's made to clean out the ashes from the fireplace. And that's why she's always covered in ash and called Ash Girl. And they call her that in a very derogatory way. And she has to do all the cooking and all the cleaning. And so she doesn't really complain. She feels like, well, she just misses her mom and she's just trying to get along. So one day the father comes to the three daughters and he says, I'm going to market. What can I bring you back? And one of the daughters says, I would love some, gowns of velvet. Bring me velvet gowns. And the other daughter says, I want ribbons of gold and silver rings. Like, bring me back like jewels and rings. And then he looks to his daughter, to Cinderella, and he says, what would you like? And she says, I don't really want anything, but if you must bring me something, bring me the branch of a tree that knocks your hat off when you're closest to home, which is kind of an odd thing to say, but this is what she says.
Yeah. Okay.
So father goes away, he comes back to market. He's got gowns of velvet. He's got silver rings and ribbons of gold. And he gives these to the two elder daughters. And to Cinderella, he presents her with a hazel branch, which as he was rounding the corner to come home, a hazel tree knocked his hat off. And so he snapped a branch off. And this is evidence of like some, Cinderella witchery in my opinion.
Okay.
But so he gives her this branch and she promptly takes it out and she plants it on her mother's grave. And in a relatively short period of time, it grows into a decent sized tree. And she frequently goes out to this tree and she's got some roses growing on it and she tends her mother's grave and she weeps and her tears go into the ground and into the roots of this tree. So this tree knows all of Cinderella's sorrows, all of the abuse she's endured, all of the frustration she has. Then one day an invitation comes for the ball. We know this part of the story. The sisters get very excited. They get their beautiful new gowns. Cinderella finds an old gown that belonged to her mother and she kind of fixes that up. And when she puts it on to go to the ball, they all, laugh and say she can't go. This whole time you're wondering, like, why isn't the father defending her? But I don't know. He's a jerk. He's a beholden to his new wife, I guess.
Yeah.
So they don't tear the gown apart so much as they just make her do all of these chores, and little by little the thing gets dirty. And then just before they're all leaving, one of the sisters says, well, you have to pick up all the lentils first. And she takes a bag full of lentils and scatters them across the kitchen. And of course, anyone who knows, lentils are very tiny little stones. They're all in that. So at this point, she just gives up. She's picky. She's sweeping it up. Her gown is ruined. So she finally gets it all done. And she goes back out to the tree and she's sort of weeping and she hears something in this tree. It might be the birds. It might be just a voice. And so she says, shake, shake, hazel tree, silver and gold over me. And down from the tree drops a beautiful gown and a beautiful pair of slippers of silver. Which is this gorgeous silver gown and silver shoes to match that fits her perfectly. And she takes off the rags and the birds pick up the rags and bring them back up into the tree and hide them. And she's got she's transformed. And so off she goes to the ball. In the original story, there are 3 nights of the ball. So similar thing. She dances with the prince. He's falling for her. She disappears, not because she's afraid she's going to turn into a pumpkin, but because she wants to get back before the sisters and the mother and the father there, so they don't know that she's gone. And she'll get in trouble. So she goes back, and this happens 3 nights in a row. So the second night, she knows she goes out, shake, shake, hazel tree, silver and gold over me. And the tree drops down a gown of gold with golden shoes. And off she goes to the ball, enchanting the prince, and then, makes it home. Third night of the ball comes up. And now the prince knows she's going to run off, and he is determined to follow her. So he puts tar down on the steps. Once everyone's arrived at the bar, puts tar down on the steps, and she does her thing with the hazel tree. They drop down like a crystal gown, like a gown that's just sewn with a million diamonds and these glass shoes. And she goes and she enchants the prince even more, and they're dancing all night. And then she goes to leave, and she runs out, and one of her shoes gets stuck in the tar. So now he's got her shoe, and she's slowed down because she's only got one shoe on. So she's trying to run, and he's able to catch up with her enough to see what garden like what walled neighborhood she went into. So he knows she lives in that area. So a similar part of the story that we know, he puts out a declaration, whoever can fit this shoe is going to be, my bride. And he targets that neighborhood. He knows it's got to be somewhere in there because he saw her disappear. Meanwhile, everything's hidden back. The birds in the tree have taken care of it. No one thinks that she's gone to this ball. So he comes around. He's making the rounds. He comes to the house and he starts with the first sister, and she goes to put the shoe on, and the mother said she can't get her heel in. And so the mother says, it doesn't matter. When you are living in that castle with that man, you're not going to need your heel. So just cut it off. And so the mother whacks the daughter's heel off. And she slips the shoe on and it fits.
Oh my God.
And so the prince, who somehow doesn't seem to notice that there's, this blood gushing out of the shoe, sees the shoe fits. Everybody declares it fits, and off they ride into the carriage. They're going to go off to the castle. And as they pass under the hazel tree that grows over Cinderella's mother's grave, he can hear this. And to the prince's credit, he's the only other person in these stories that can hear the birds the way that Cinderella does. So he hears, there's blood in the shoe. There's blood in the shoe. Your true bride still waits for you. So he hears that, he looks down, he sees the bloody shoe, he turns the carriage around and he goes back and he says, she's not my true bride. So the next sister comes along. Well, it was obviously me. You must have mixed this up. It was obviously me. I'm going to put this shoe on. You'll see she can't get her big toe inside. So the mother says, listen, you're not going to need that big toe. Like, people are going to just wait on you hand and foot. Let's just cut it off and it'll fit in there. So she chops her daughter's toe off. And lo and behold, the shoe fits. And the prince is like, okay, the shoe fit. Okay, this makes sense. He knows it's from this house. He knows this is the neighborhood.
Yeah, right.
So he's, and he's desperate. So off he goes. And as they pass under the tree, there's blood in the shoe. There's blood in the shoe. Your true bride still waits for you. And he looks down and he sees all this blood pouring out of the shoe. And he turns around and he goes back. And he says to the father, is there anyone else that lives in this house? Is there anyone else that lives here? And he says, well, there's just Cinderella, but she didn't go to the ball. And he says, I don't care. She's trying the shoe on. So she puts the shoe on. Of course it fits because it's her damn shoe to begin with. And away they go. They ride out under the tree. And as they pass under the tree, they hear, there's no blood in the shoe. There's no blood in the shoe. Your true bride sits beside you. So now, as they're riding off to the sunset, the next scene is their marriage. And you'd think, okay, this is already like brutal enough. So they are married. She is walking out of the church in her beautiful gown and the bells are ringing. And the two sisters come up on either side of her, hobbling a little bit because they've got, their toes have been altered by their mother. And they just lock arms with her and they start saying, well, we all live together in the castle. It's just going to be so wonderful. And suddenly they're her best friends, right? And just then birds swoop down, presumably birds that were protecting her from the enchanted tree. They swoop down and they peck the stepsister's eyes out. And that's how the story ends. So,
my gosh. Yeah.
And that's, and that is a retelling of a story that predated probably even by a few centuries, the Grimm brothers writing it down. And of course, stories are reflective of the time. So that story has been retold. As I said, Perrault introduced the pumpkin. I think he may also have introduced the fairy godmother into it. I'm not sure exactly what year that came into it. The Disney version was adapted for a specific kind of, 1950s type of aesthetic. So the story has been retold again and again, but it's always fun to kind of like check back in and hear those early versions.
Yeah. I love that. That was so interesting, Varla.
Sometimes I do that story live and I have a slideshow. I've got some great graphics.
I bet
that was a lot of fun to build out.
That.
Yeah.
I got
bloody shoe stuff.
To be honest with you, I thought you were going to say that the sisters came up and like chopped off Cinderella's legs or something like that and said, well, no, she can't fit.
No, but this is interesting because throughout the story, there are these little indications, if you're able to read between the lines, that Cinderella has a connection with the supernatural world. From the hazel branch being knocked off, the hazel tree growing in her mother's grave, which traditionally hazel is a conduit for speaking with the dead.
Yeah.
And so there's an element of that in there. The idea that the mother is kind of supernaturally protecting her. She can hear birds. We have that even in the most modern versions of Cinderella. She's friends with all the birds and the mice, and they help her. Well, she's able to communicate with animals. That's another kind of supernatural ability often attributed to witches. Then only certain people being able to, you see this frequently in fairy tales where only certain people are able to see these signs or communicate in this way, which is traditional in, in the fairy realm in general. Not everyone can see fairies. It's part of the second sight. It's part of that ability to see something beyond the regular human perception. So there's all these indications. And what I loved about exploring the fairy tales from a botanical point of view is that you could really see and learn a lot about the history of those plants through that, for how they were used. Because if I were to put in, if I put in a willow tree into that story, it would be a very different story.
Correct.
Because we associate willows with healing and with mourning. There's just a lot of ways that by changing out that plant, things changed. And so the hazel tree isn't in that story once the pumpkin's introduced. The pumpkin kind of takes place, this magical pumpkin patch.
Yeah, exactly. And it's really interesting that, as you know, plants take a really lead in mythology. I mean, the tree of life, there's a whole bunch of everything's associated with plants and so on and so forth, and trees and nature and whatever you want to say.
So many of our plant names that we know today, the things that are blooming in our gardens, like hyacinths, those are named after Hyacinthus, who was Apollo's lover, who basically got hit in the head with a big heavy disc because one of the wind gods was jealous and he died on the spot, and Apollo transformed Hyacinthus into this plant his blood turned into this hyacinth plant that would come back every year and release this fragrance and remind everyone of Hyacinth and what a beautiful soul he was. And there's so many plant stories. Like, that's really at the core of many these Greek myths about someone dying and the gods having the ability not to keep them immortal or restore them back to life, but to keep them sort of immortal through natural, like the pomegranate or whatever it is. So
yeah, exactly. Well, again, this has been another amazing time. We learned so much, and it's so fun to have you on again, and you're always welcome back, Varla, because there's plenty of stories we can talk about and have more fun. So thank you again.
We can do mermaids when we get closer to summer.
Yeah, I would love to do that. I'd love to talk mermaids and everything. Because again, there's so much rich mythology, there's so much fun with it, and that it still affects our daily lives even into now,
Yeah.
and
Isn't that amazing?
You just think these things would disappear over there, but no, they haven't. And
no, they endure. They endure through the plant names. They endure through the tales. They endure through our use of the plants. And something as simple as drinking tea. So it's pretty remarkable.
Exactly. And again, folks, you can eat corn. So
totally eat corn. Corn is really good for you. And actually, a lot of times when you buy corn, like canned corn in the store, look on the label. It'll say that it has lime in it, or it'll say it has some kind of something that has helped break that barrier down so the niacin is released. Yeah, there's nothing. So the thing is we get niacin from a lot of other sources now, right? So we're not relying on one thing. And that's the important thing in that story, is that it was a food that was used as a solitary source for a lot of people for a long enough period of time that it was able to create a disease and a deficiency.
Yeah. And that's just the way people viewed it as vampirism was interesting. Like I said, it just wasn't that. It was some other diseases during that time that would, cause people to have that vampire craze or epidemic, whatever you want to say.
Yeah.
is super, super interesting to me. I did read something before we go. I just want your opinion on this. I don't know if this is true, but I heard something about with part of the Salem witch trials, because they would eat wheat a lot, that had something to do with some of the crazy things that happened during the witch trials. I don't know if that's true, but it kind
Okay,
of makes sense.
so certainly the European witch trials, there was something called ergot that is a fungus and it grows on rye in particular.
Oh,
And
okay.
so people were experiencing ergot poisoning, and it is believed that that contributed to a lot of the stories about seeing witches cavort with the devil. And
Yeah.
if you're familiar at all with that Hieronymus Bosch painting, it's called The Garden of Earthly Delights.
No.
And it's a triptych, and it's basically like insane debauchery happening and all of these people cavorting with all kinds of things.
Sure.
And that is the era in which, in fact, I believe people think that he may have had some ergot poisoning. And the thing is like taking a hallucinogen in a ritual sense and knowing that you're going to be seeing things is totally different than having like mild hallucinogenic poison where things are appearing around you all the time. So that was happening, and all of the like fear and unknown throughout that the eras, like from the 1400s through the 1700s. In Europe, you had that as like a real epidemic. In Salem, there may have been something similar. I was actually I did a talk at the Salem Witch Museum, and so I don't want to misspeak on this, but there were a variety of things that were into play, and a lot of it had to do with a very, very repressed society with very strict rules in a very dark, cold period of time, with I think quite a bit of food deficiency and other things like that. So I'm not sure if wheat played into the Salem witch trials so much, but it may have.
Yeah, exactly. But it's just interesting if that was one of the causes, being that it's been a cause across the history of certain diets and everything and plants and so on and so forth that have led to some, well, let's be honest, some pretty horrific things, some pretty crazy things happening.
There's still like it's called Jimson wheat or Jamestown wheat, and that's a form of datura. I think it's Datura strenonium. It's one of the strongest hallucinogens, and people were eating the leaves for salad greens, not knowing that it was this really, really toxic plant that was making them hallucinate and like freak out on each other.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks, Varla. Do you want to give my spooky friends anything coming up that you're working on that you want to share?
Yeah. So website, varlaventura.net. I have a new book coming out in October of this year. Yay! It's called Rotten Botany, and it's another botanical book. This one is kind of an exploration of all the like strange and devious plants out there. And it's less about, there's history and lore. It's less about... And there's medicine. It's less about the folklore and more about the strange plant behavior and how they adapted. And there's care tips in there. And so it's everything from like why corpse flowers smell like corpses to carnivorous plants to strange mushrooms to strangler figs. And I'm really excited about that one. So that's coming out in October 2026.
Love it.
You can pre-order it now, in fact.
Yes, let's do that, folks. All the links and stuff will be in the episode notes, so you can check that out. And also, her book, Enchanted Plants.
Yes.
I'll make sure, you give her some love on that. But thank you so much, Varla. We will definitely get you back on to talk mermaids. Maybe if you're not too busy in October, we can have you back on to talk about your new book. That would be awesome, too. Yeah. So I love that.
Great.
All right.
I'd love that too.
Thanks, Varla, and stay spooky.
Me. Thank you.